Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this Sturmtiger by Zvezda. This is a plastic snap-fit kit in 15mm or 1/100th scale. I've heard and seen good things about this model, so I was pretty excited when I saw it on the shelf in a local hobby shop. The back of the box looks how you would expect the back of a Zvezda box to look. The number of parts, length of the model, and box contents are all listed. There's also a trio of images of the assembled but unpainted model from various angles. I kind of like this better than painted examples, as nice as they look. It's a more accurate representation of what to expect from the kit. This kit comes on 2 sprues, which came in a protective plastic bag. There aren't a whole lot of parts for this kit, 19 in fact, as the box says. These sprues are quite neat and crisply moulded. It's a Zvezda kit, so it's not surprising that the details are a little bit simplified. That said, they're still pretty good in my opinion. The grills on the engine deck and the front of the gun, for example, are quite nicely detailed. The exhaust pipes, however, not so much. The tracks are one piece and the wheels look great, but the outside of the treads are barely detailed at all. That's fine, those are compromises that make the model easier and cheaper to make. Rambling aside, the parts are neat and the mold lines should be quick and easy to remove, and I can't see any defects or obvious flaws. The instructions are slightly more detailed than some of the other Zvezda kits I've built. The exploded diagrams are on both sides of the leaflet. They look clear and easy enough to follow, though they do have one flaw that I will point out when I get to it. Let's put this beast together. The first step is to build the lower hull. This is a simple matter of installing these 2 pieces of internal bracing, for lack of a better description. There are 2 pins on each of these parts that correspond with 4 holes in the hull. These should be placed with the 2 pins on the side facing out away from the hull, corresponding with the 2 openings there. In other words, they go on how I've placed them, just as the instructions illustrated. Sometimes I'm not a rebel. Next, the outer hull sides and suspension gear parts can be slotted onto the posts I mentioned before. This is really simple. A little pressure might be needed, but it does go on easily enough and it stays there, being a snap-together kit and all. Of course, I have no reason to disassemble it later, so I add glue to all of the connection points to secure them in place. I even apply some to the gaps along the bottom so it seeps in between the parts for a little bit of extra strength. If you ask me, it looks pretty good so far. Next come the single-piece tracks. These do look pretty good, if you ignore the lack of tread detail. There are pins on the hull sides that guide the positioning of the tracks, but as you can maybe see, the pins on the suspension gear aren't actually long enough to reach the track sets at all. It's not really a big issue, it just means they're not really worth applying glue to. The left track does look a little bit wonky, but it's not too bad and otherwise they look decent. Very tracky. I then snap on this front piece of armor plating. You might be able to see that it has a very slight angle to the sides. The wider part should go towards the top of the hull. The pins on the back will work as a guide. I add some glue where the pins poke in through the hull part to bond it in place. Now it's time to work on the upper part of the vehicle, starting with the main gun. First, we need to install the ball mount part the gun will attach to. This is made up of 2 parts. Here's where we need to deviate from the instructions. The instructions say the mounting protrusion for the gun should be on the lower half of the ball. This would result in the gun shield part being installed upside down. The solution is simple, just install the ball mounting around the other way, with the protrusion for the gun on the upper half. The join is a bit gappy, but that's okay. It's unlikely to be visible at all. For the time being, I leave this unglued so that I can attach the rest of the gun before I decide how I want it to be elevated. I then clip the gun mantlet part on. This is simple. I very carefully add a bit of glue in behind it, making sure not to get any on the ball mount. I also add a bit on the front. It looks much neater already. Next comes this gun shield. Is it a gun shield or a mantlet? I think it's a gun shield. Either way, as Fog of War points out in his video, the instructions want us to install the shield with its tapered part facing upwards. In reality, it should be facing down. It's a simple fix if you know about it before you begin construction, but at this point in the build it would be very hard to correct. The reason for this error, I believe, is that they designed this kit based on the Sturmtiger at Kubinka, which, for whatever reason, has this shield part installed upside down. That shield part can then be glued into place. It fits nicely onto its mounting post, which is of course keyed, so it'll be nice and straight with no effort. Then the end of the gun goes on. Again, it's easy, the keying makes sure it's on nice and straight. I apply a bit of pressure to try and minimize gaps. I then apply glue to the ball mounting inside the casemate and elevate the gun to where I think it looks good. And that's the gun installed. It was the most fiddly part of the build. Not that it was hard, just that the rest of the kit is so simple. I then add the machine gun. It was a little bit fiddly to get into place, and I probably should have installed this before the main gun, but it just didn't occur to me. The glue looks a little bit messy here, but it should look fine once it's dry. Next, it's time to join the two halves of the Sturmtiger. There are, unsurprisingly, pins for this that slot into the holes in the upper hull very easily. I apply pressure again to minimize gaps, though the only one that you really need to worry about is the one at the front of the vehicle. This goes together very well indeed. After that, we need to fill in this gaping hole at the rear of the vehicle. This is where we place the whole rear part, obviously. This has two holes to match the two rear-facing posts on the central supporty bits. It goes into place very easily, and for the most part it looks good. The detailing on the exhausts is definitely lacking. I guess you could work on them if it was an issue for you, but it's not a problem for me. What is an issue are the gaps at the corners of the hull. I don't want those to be there. I apply glue and use pressure to force the gaps as closed as I could get them. The result is not perfect, but it is an improvement. I then install this little detail. This is the air intake. The Feifel air filters would have connected to this part, and this is what remained after those filters were removed. The part slots into place nicely, guided by two pins. And finally, the loading crane, because the ammo for this thing is, unsurprisingly, quite large. I did manage to break this part along the top while removing mold lines. As you can see, it's not quite perfect. Definitely be careful with this, it's a bit fragile. There's a D-shaped hole in the top of the roof into which this can slot. I found the fit to be quite tight, so I used the flat of my knife to apply pressure. I couldn't get my fingers into where I needed to push without breaking the part further. Once it's in place, I add some glue and that's it, Sturmtiger complete. Let's compare it with the resin and metal Sturmtiger from Battlefront that I built a while ago. You can see right off the bat that these are quite different looking. The Battlefront miniature, being resin and metal, is more chunky and has a rougher, more handmade look to it, while the plastic Zvezda model has straight, precise edges and looks much neater. Neither is really better than the other in my opinion, though I definitely prefer the plastic model for the most part. It's just personal preference, mostly in the materials that I like to work with. I much prefer working with plastic than resin and metal. You can see at the front here that the Zvezda model is a little bit shorter than the Battlefront one. The details are pretty similar, except one has zimmerit and the other doesn't. All the details are roughly in the same places. The gun on the Battlefront model looks to be a little bit smaller, but it does have the tip of a projectile visible inside of it, which I rather like. And I wish the Zvezda kit had that detail. I guess you could add that yourself if you really wanted to. Moving towards the rear, you can see that most of the same stuff is present on both models, with only slight differences. The resin model is definitely more detailed, and the Zvezda one looks a lot neater. The main difference here, in my eyes, is the exhaust covers are present on the resin model, and again I wish the plastic model had that. From above, the models look to be roughly the same in size, so the only noticeable difference in their dimensions is height, and that's pretty minor too. On the sides you can see the difference in the side skirts. It's pretty major. You could damage the ones on the Zvezda kit like I did the Battlefront one, but it would be a lot more work. Also, the resin one has tools that are absent on the plastic model. That's not really surprising. Zvezda's kits do have a lot of simplified detail, which is fine. My conclusion is that both of these kits are decent. They're both obviously gaming models and they have compromises in their designs that reflect that. There are things about both that I like. Ideally, I would have a model that incorporated the best aspects of both kits, but I don't have one like that. I have these. I don't imagine that you would see swarms of Sturmtigers roaming gaming tables very often, or real-life battlefields for that matter, but I think these models would look fine on the table together. Their differences are kind of obvious, but that might be lessened with the application of some paint. So in the end, I think this is a decent kit, and it was very easy to put together. Most of the parts fit without issue, and there isn't a lot of mold line removal that needs to be done. The only issue with the assembly is the gun shield that will be upside down if you follow the instructions. I'd like to say thanks to Fog of War. Without him and his video on this kit, I would have built mine with the gun shield upside down too. Not being in possession of an encyclopedic knowledge of tanks or anything, I would have definitely missed that error. I think it's something most people would miss. I mean, even the people that designed the kit missed it. It's not so much a flaw in the instructions or the model really, it's the result of the designer using only one prototype example as a reference. I guess there probably aren't a lot of these left in the wild, or museums. The detailing on this model is nice and crisp. Sure, it's not super detailed, and that's fine. If you are buying gaming models looking for extreme detail, you're doing it wrong. The simplified details are part of why Zvezda's gaming models are so cheap, and I think that's a big part of their appeal. They're cheap enough that you can buy armies worth of models without going broke, and they still look pretty good. I'm not sure how effective a vehicle like the Sturmtiger is in games like Flames of War, but at least it looks cool and kind of scary. So what do you think of this Sturmtiger? Do you prefer the Battlefront version? Do you think it's not at all ridiculous and very sensible? I know I do. Let me know in the comments section below. And of course, if you haven't done so already, feel free to subscribe to me here on YouTube, follow me on social media, and watch me live stream on Twitch. And if you really like the things I do, please consider helping to support the channel over at Patreon. It's where all the cool people are. And I'm there too. Links to all of those are in the description below. I shall return soon, so until then, happy Sturmtigering and thanks for watching. Farewell.